The dropship coughed itself empty 2 meters too high, pancaked into red grit, and left Maeve Arden face down in a century of other people's dust and promises. Her welcome brochure, digital, cheerful, and sand-scoured, called the place Agri Grant Parcel K612 on planet Kadish. Climate arid variable. Assets legacy domes, water loop, atmospheric pack, and liabilities none noted, which was the first joke the planet told her. The second joke was the habitat, which wheezed like a courtroom old enough to remember justice. Its once white ribs burned to the color of old blood, and its air filters stuffed with a mat of desiccated seed fluff that had never touched soil. Maeve had 30 planetary days to demonstrate agricultural viability, or the parcel. Reverted by covenant to Helios Vance combined for resource optimization, which sounded like mining even in the nice font. She inventoried what had survived the crash and the bureaucracy, her granddad's hand spade, a crate of heirloom seeds labeled with names like prayers, 2 solar blankets that had clearly lost an argument with a star, and a backpack fusion kettle that believed in tea the way some people believe in revenge. Logs in the Hab console were a history of trying and leaving, a family who'd planted hope in Rose until the domes blew, a cooperative who stayed 6 months and learned that storms keep secrets, a single mother who wrote poems about wind and then stopped writing entirely. Threaded through the logs was a noise report beeping from Sector 12, the kind of note humans leave themselves when they're pretending not to be curious. By dusk, she'd patched the Hab, bullseyed 3 panels back into submission with epoxy and begging, and declared the water loop alive but grieving. The storm wall on the western horizon flickered with the hunger of things. That move and don't apologize, and it pushed Maeve toward the only building not on the official map, a half-buried, low-slung shed with a door that opened like a throat remembering speech. It wasn't a shed, it was a surveyor vault from the first wave, earth steel and stubborn, still sealed with a code etched into a brass plate that said, with modesty, if found, please be careful with the future. Inside, a geological array slept under a tarp older than some cities, surrounded by crates of calibration stones, and a thermos labeled property of Dr. Rennie Mani, whose name lived in textbooks alongside breakthroughs, and footnotes, and a disappeared line item called Kaddish Expedition. Maeve juiced the array with the dropship's last good battery and watched a courier. Of ghosts wake-up magnetometers singing, neutrino scintillators clearing their throats, gravimetry painting the subsurface in false color that made truth look edible. The scan bloomed a kilometer down, and then kept blooming, revealing caverns braided like capillaries under the outpost, and inside those caverns, filaments the array refused to name, labeling them with a placeholder, Lattice 77A. The spectral signature was wrong in all the profitable ways room temperature flux conduction across crystalline faults, density curves that made superconductors look like folk art, and a phase response that implied the lattice could carry not just current, but instruction. It was not ore. It was architecture, miles of it, a city of light that had never seen a sky. That's why they sent me to farm, Maeve said to the empty vault, and the empty vault agreed by creaking in a language called gravity. Engines approached across the flats with the confidence of contracts, and a rover the size of a grudge pulled into her yard, wearing Helios Vance livery that hadn't learned humility yet. 3 suits stepped out, polished in premium, led by a man with desert in his smile and bankruptcy in his eyes. Ms. Arden, he said, delighted by his own civility. Director Cale Rusk, she replied, because people who help ruin your life deserve the courtesy of accurate names. Helios Vance admires Mavericks, Rusk said, producing a datapad that smelled like non-disclosure. 50,000 credits to relieve you of this burden and fly you someplace where seasons exist. 50,000 won't buy back the apology your merger owes my last crew, Maeve said, and Rusk's smile learned a new edge called tomorrow's problem. This is not a negotiation, he said softly. This is a kindness. Then be kind somewhere else, said another voice from the door, and a woman stepped in with a carbine worn like a habit, a contractor's badge that had learned to be useful, and eyes that could identify lies by their gait. Name's Rhea Calder, she said to Maeve. Independent operator. You hired me for 30 days as security and salvage consult per colonial statute. Maeve blinked once, realized what Rhea was offering, and nodded as if she'd planned this trick all year. "Then we're done here," Rhea told Rusk, because accidents on a colony with a witnessed contract become investigations, and Rusk was allergic to courts. He left with a promise that sounded like weather, and the yard was quiet again, except for the planet practicing its vowels. "Why me?" Maeve asked when their shoulders had learned each other's weight in the Hab's small kitchen. "Because you don't quit for pretty reasons," Rhea said, pouring kettle tea into 2 cups with the gravitas of treaties. "And because you don't know yet what's under your boots." Maeve showed her the vault, and Rhea showed Maeve a chip with Dr. Ren Imani's signature embedded like a heartbeat. "My aunt ran logistics for Imani," Rhea said. "When the expedition vanished off paper, the Combine bought the silence and kept the map, pieces of it anyway. I've been stealing the rest from people who say optimization with their mouths full. They stitched their secrets together into something that looked like a plan and tasted like audacity. Growing topside was a dare for later. They took the mining rig Rhea had cached in Canyon Shade years ago, mated it to the Hab's sober reactor, and carved stairs into the crimson beneath, following the scan's arteries to a chamber where the world's underskin pulsed with lattice 77A light. Up top, Maeve planted a decoy bed of hardy millet in a shelter patch to feed the drone's boredom and satisfaction reports. Below, she planted something else entirely. The caverns held fossil ice from a planetary adolescence when Kaddish had flirted with a kinder orbit. And when they melted that ice through filters built from prayer and old tubing, the water came out tasting like time and almosts. The lattice hummed on the edge of hearing, a note that made roots want to find verbs. So Maeve laid down thin soil beds on rock, warmed by geology, and sang the oldest song she knew, "Germinate, reach, please." On day 9, Green found a way. It wasn't pretty cotyledons like exhausted tongues, stems that flinched when dust fell, but it was agriculture, and it was under the floor where storms could not invoice. Helios Vance adjusted their strategy the way snakes shed paperwork. Supply flights misrouted. Repair drones forgot she existed. The Hab water loop woke to find its throat cut by thermite that had learned where pipes dream. Rhea came out of the smoke with singed hair and a grin made of litigation. "They escalated," she coughed. "So do we," Maeve said, steady, because anger is a tool only if you sand it smooth. Rhea pinged the settlements. Helios Vance had hollowed out in 3 sectors, and by dawn pickups arrived with people who introduced themselves by damage first, names second. An ex-rig boss framed for embezzlement when he refused to sign off on a dead man valve. A pair of sisters whose family claim had been lawyered into mist by Rusk with a handshake he never paid for. A medic who knew how to keep lungs convinced of their purpose during sand season. They didn't make an army. They made a workshop. The plan was unheroic and therefore perfect. They stabilized the approach berm so Helios Vance rovers drop into prepared cavities without dying. Force the fight into caverns where maps favor honesty, record everything with lenses that speak court. Stormfronts like that don't ask permission. And Rusk arrived on day 23 with mercenaries whose rifles had only ever met compliance. The earth folded along dotted lines Maeve had drawn on the underside of her patience, and half his cordon slid into a tunnel labeled with a number only Rhea knew and a trap only physics admired. Surface skirmishes lasted 11 minutes and 2 bruises. Underground, the ex-rig boss introduced Helios Vance to ventilation as tactic, and the sisters introduced a clause called consequence. When the dust shook hands with silence, Rusk was standing alone in a suit that needed tailoring and a future that needed witnesses. "You can't win this," he said, less certain than he'd practiced. "We already decided not to lose," Maeve said, and led the procession down. The chamber they entered was a cathedral from a faith that worshipped conductivity. Lattice 77A veined the walls in webs of pale blue that pulsed on a timescale slower than greed. And for a moment, even Rusk forgot to be a person in order to learn to be small. "This isn't ore," Maeve said. "This is instruction. Think of what it does for power, for comms, for whatever we haven't invented, because we've been too busy stealing." "You don't have the capital," Rusk whispered, "because when all runs out, money tries to be language." "We have a network," Rhea said, tapping her temple, and then the uplink Maeve had built from lies and spare parts. Imani's logs, full survey, samples, the map of this chamber, all pushed to the Colonial Science Foundation, 5 universities, and the Independent Miners Guild with a timestamp that says none of us gets to own it alone. Rusk sagged like a chin. Contract whose signatures had learned ethics. Maeve put a spadeful of cavern soil in his hand and said, "This is what you thought was worthless. Behold value above them." The storm walked past without stopping to read their names. Helios Vance responded the way empires do when a peasant invents tomorrow without filing a form. They sent lawyers like weather and drones like flies in a cease and persist order that tried to sound paternal. Maeve printed it and used it to level the Habs' crook table. The Colonial Science Foundation pinged back with an hour's receipt confirmed. Provisional stewardship granted to Arden Cooperative, pending adjudication and safety protocols. A miners' guild sent advice disguised as gossip. 3 universities sent grad students who asked permission correctly and brought decent coffee. Rhea set up a perimeter of cameras that knew to be kind to panic. The ex-rig boss Gav rewired the Hab with redundancy like a love letter. The Petro sisters Anja and Alexei mapped the cavern system with chalk and rumor. The medic Sol established a clinic where the triage protocol began with tea. Meanwhile, the millet bed topside did what decoys do lied convincingly. Maeve filed daily photos of sprouts that were 2 weeks old and 6 months wise. The drones approved her diligence. Below, the lattice sang on a frequency that turned bones into tuning forks. Maeve noticed something odd as she checked root mats. Plants closest to the glowing veins weren't just growing, they were learning. Their stomata patterns adjusted before humidity shifted. Their roots chose paths with the confidence of maps. "It's carrying more than charge," she told Rhea. "It's carrying instruction. Like a nervous system the planet forgot to brag about," Rhea said. "Can we talk on it?" Gav asked, a man whose hands had been punished for curiosity. "Carefully," Maeve said, "and only with consent." She looked at the lattice the way you look at a river before deciding if it's a road. They built a test with reverence. A small coil wrapped around a painless vein, a modulation protocol written in apology, a phrase encoded not as words but as rhythm. "We're here to help. Do you agree?" They sent the pulse at dawn when even greed sleeps. The lattice replied by brightening 1 lumen, then dimming in a pattern that Sol called a heartbeat. In the root bed, the millet paused, stopped transpiring for half a second in a synchronized breath, and then resumed faster. "Consent," Maeve said, surprised to hear herself crying. It answered yes. They tried a message next, nothing grand, just a map from Chamber A to Clinic, so the lost could find stitches faster. The lattice hummed, and later that hour, a technician stumbled into the right tunnel, on the first try wearing the expression of someone who has been gently corrected by the world. Word got out. The honest way, first people who had lived on Kadesh a long time began arriving with offerings and requests. A herder from the North Ridge, who swore the ground, sometimes warned of sinkholes. A schoolteacher from a windward shack who wanted to know if the lattice could carry lullabies to kids scared of storm nights. Maeve set rules on a whiteboard that bored heroes to death. No commerce on the lattice, no lies, no orders. Requests only. Gratitude mandatory. Helios Vance came back with an injunction to shut down unauthorized communications. Rhea stapled it to the restroom wall. The universities sent a dozen lawyers with pockets full of precedents and sandwiches. The guild published a position paper titled, "Don't Be Stupid About Wonders." Rusk himself returned in a new suit that fit worse. "You're trespassing on infrastructure," he said, gesturing at the lattice like a man pointing at a cathedral and calling it scaffolding. "It's not infrastructure," Maeve replied. "It's a neighbor. Neighbors pay taxes," he said. "Neighbors bring soup," Sol corrected, handing him a bowl he didn't know how to hold. They ran into their first real emergency the following week. A storm line stalled and multiplied, birthing a dust twister that made towers out of rage and aimed one at a settlement called Sablespine. Radios choked on static. Helios Vance offered evacuation packages with a payment plan that smelled like debt. Maeve stood in the lattice chamber and placed both palms on a vein that felt like winter and music. "We need to route 50 people through tunnels they've never seen," she whispered. "May we ask?" The lattice warmed under her hands like consent. They encoded a simple rhythm. From Sablespine's cistern, Down 3 steps, left at the fault scar, pause to breathe, turn when the hum deepens. Kadesh's underskin pulsed the message outward. Within minutes, Saul's clinic filled with people who had arrived by faith and rhythm, faces dust-masked and eyes ridiculous with survival. A child wearing a scarf with planets on it tugged Maeve's sleeve. The floor sang, the child said solemnly. The twister found sable spine and tore roofs like paper dolls. It didn't find the people. Rhea watched the feed with her jaw unclenched for the first time in a season. We just turned geology into a public service, she said. Helios Vance's PR wing struck back. They announced lattice access services and filed patents for subsurface guidance monetization. Guild posted a meme of a grandmother unplugging their servers. The judge, who had learned to schedule remembering, issued a temporary order. No enclosures of commons during disasters. Maeve realized they were winning when a bored teenager showed up to volunteer and left in charge of the whiteboard rules. Teenagers are the antibodies of bad ideas. The board grew teeth. Then the lattice did something nobody had asked for. It pulsed a rhythm none of them had set, slow, patient, insistent. Gav translated it into a path none of their maps contained. The route led to a collapsed lode miles from the hab, a place Helios Vance had written off as unprofitable. They followed, because why else be alive? The tunnel opened into a hall where the lattice piled thick as roots around something that was not rock. Rhea brushed grit away with fingers made for careful. A plaque emerged, Imani Expedition Safe House, and beneath it a locker with cold packs, rations, a bound ledger, and a recorder that still held a charge. Ren Imani's voice filled the smallness. If you've found this, either we're late or you're early. The lattice is a nervous system for a planet that practices. Don't use it to command. Ask, offer, trade safety for songs. Oh, and Helios Vance will try to buy it. Let them buy each other. The ledger contained pages of patterns that help, like a recipe book written by geology, a fold that calms quakes, a hum that quiets flash flood impulses, a glow schedule that helps roots find water without stealing from neighbors. They carried the book home like a newborn. The universities wept. The guild tried to adopt it. Sol photocopied it on the clinic's stubborn machine and posted 3 copies to the canteen under a sign that read, Use, Return, ADD. Helios Vance sued again, this time for theft of proprietary geological advantage. The hearing was public and mean. Rusk performed sincerity poorly. Maeve testified well and briefly. Rhea submitted recordings, rescue logs, and a whiteboard with teenager handwriting. The judge wrote the opinion in ordinary words. You cannot own a neighbor. That night, with the storm far off, and the hab smelling like stew and victory that didn't need to brag, Maeve returned to the chamber. What do you want? She asked the lattice, because partnership is a question. The vein under her palms warmed once, then brightened 3 times. 3 asks, Rhea translated, grinning. Even geology has conditions. Name them, Maeve whispered. The hum shaped into rhythm. Share, schedule, stay. We can do that, Maeve said. We can do all of that. The whiteboard rules moved from a wall to a charter, because paper gets tired of being temporary. The first article read like a promise a city makes to itself when it has finally met its job. The lattice is a commons. Number orders, no invoices, requests only, gratitude mandatory. The second article scheduled remembering. The third forbade selling fear. Helios Vance held a rally in the nearest jurisdiction they could rent. Rusk stood on a stage decorated with graphs and insisted that unmanaged access would cause geopolitical instability. He promised oversight. The crowd, which contained exactly as many locals as could be bribed with lunch, applauded on cue. Maeve scheduled a vote on the pier at dusk. No stage, no lights, only a ledger of almost and the habit of stacking chairs. People arrived with their damages and their spoons. The teenagers ran the microphone like gatekeepers of honesty. A grandmother spoke about the day a tunnel warned her to slow and her grandson lived. A trawler described how a hum had calmed a cliff long enough for a rescue. A schoolteacher asked if the lattice could carry a lullaby on storm nights so the shelter didn't taste like fear. The vote felt like a foregone conclusion, and that was fine. It passed. The charter became law, the kind of law that works, because it is also furniture. The judge signed. the guild signed. 3 university provosts asked if they could sign without pretending it mattered more because they did. Helios Vance responded with their last good trick, sabotage dressed as tragedy. An auxiliary shaft collapsed 2 ridges over, exactly where a rogue prospector had been filming a redemption arc. The blast wave rippled through the lattice. The hum turned ragged. The clinic filled. Ria's eyes went calculation cold. Rusk wants us to choke, she said. He wants panic on the network so he can sell calm. Then we send calm first, Maeve answered, and laid both palms on the lattice. Permission to soothe? The vein warmed like a hand in a hand. They encoded the shelter lullaby the schoolteacher had asked for 4 notes and a pause. Then 3, then a hum that sounds like soup. The lattice carried it out across stone, in caves and reinforced storerooms, in culverts and improvised dens. Frightened people heard a rhythm their grandparents might have known and discovered that breath can be taught. The clinic grew quiet enough for medicine to be seen doing its work. The collapse stabilized into rubble with manners. The rogue prospector feed cut to static when a teenager unplugged it and taped a note. No. At dawn, with dust sifting itself into corners like shame, Rusk arrived with an emergency injunction to place the lattice under corporate trusteeship for safety. He had a new suit that still didn't love him. He had a drone army that was allergic to minutes. He had a court order signed by a judge who had never seen a storm. The local bench convened anyway under the pier string lights and before coffee, which is the correct time to do law. Ria presented rescue logs and lullaby metrics. Sol presented survival rates. Maeve presented the charter and the whiteboard in teenager handwriting. The judge read, yawned, and wrote an opinion that fit on a napkin. Trusteeship denied. Commons affirmed. Go home. Rusk did not go home. You've made enemies who don't forget, he said to Maeve privately. A man rehearsing lines he hoped would sting more later. Maeve looked at the people stacking chairs around them. We remember on schedule, she said. You should try it. Work resumed, which is what victory looks like when it's healthy. The lattice carried next day information with the boredom of excellence, a warning that a sinkhole wanted to audition, a suggestion that a culvert be widened, a route for a birthing woman to reach the clinic without walking through a memory. The universities proposed a research protocol that didn't insult the locals. The guild published a manual called Patterns That Help, with a foreword by Ren Imani's ghost. Ask, offer. Don't make heroes where a chore will do. Maeve found Ria in the surveyor vault, reading Imani's ledger by headlamp. We can't keep doing this from a patched-together hab, Ria said softly. We need a house for the commons. A quiet one, Maeve replied. No marble. Tables that wobble, but can be leveled with cease and persist orders. They designed the commons. House on a napkin, a hall with benches, a clinic, a kitchen, a map wall, a whiteboard that teenagers would own by custom. Funding arrived the way water does, after you stop scaring it slow, honest, enough. The first beam went up with the sound of a community, remembering muscle memory. The first pot of stew spilled, and was a minor sacrament. When the house opened, the first event was not a gala. It was a failure meeting. Item 1. The lullaby worked, but some elders found it reminded them of sirens from an old war. Item 2. A sinkhole warning arrived late in a far settlement that had lined its cellar with insulation that muffled the hum. Item 3. The teenagers wanted a vending machine that dispensed pencils. Sol seconded. They fixed what they could and wrote down what they couldn't. The lattice brightened when people laughed at themselves, which might have been a calibration artifact or might have been approval. Helios Vance filed for bankruptcy protection in the region, a maneuver designed to freeze assets and thaw permissions. Rusk disappeared from feeds, a bad omen that tasted like reprieve. The board appointed an interim director who said, listen before leverage, and sent 2 staffers with sandwiches and a willingness to stack chairs. Nobody cheered, which is how mature places celebrate. At midnight, in the chamber that started it all, Maeve placed her hands on the vein and asked a selfish question. What do you want from me? The lattice warmed once. Share, twice. Schedule, thrice. Stay, she answered out loud, because vows like to echo. Yes, yes, yes. Ria took her hand in a grip that felt like a signed charter. We'll make boredom fashionable, Ria said, and let wonder choose its own hours. The next morning brought the smallest proof that anything matters. The schoolteacher reported that the shelter lullaby had stayed in the children's mouths after the storm. Some had hummed it to their parents. Fear had not learned to breed. The ledger recorded it as an almost prevented, and then, because teenagers ran the board, as awesome. The season turned. The millet decoy topside actually ripened, to everyone's amused surprise. The underground beds became a garden. The Commons house acquired the smell of a place that has learned to trust its own tables. Maeve stood under a sky that had stopped practicing. Disaster for the day, and realized she no longer tasted the old bitterness. She tasted work and friends and something like home. She pressed her palm to the dirt and felt, or imagined she felt, the lattice hum back a rhythm that meant completion. Not victory, completion. The first ship from off-world came full of good intentions and cameras. The second came with prospectors who said co-op, like it had stages. The third arrived with predators, suits who had learned to pronounce nationalize without spitting. Kadesh, which had been practicing being a planet in private, was suddenly trending. Maeve Arden had the advantage of not wanting fame. She wanted irrigation pipe that didn't shed ethics, clinics that outlived headlines, and people who could hear the lattice without mistaking it for destiny. The Commons House posted a sign that saved hours. We export rules, not ore. The new interim director from Helios Vance arrived carrying sandwiches and humility. She asked for a chair and then helped stack them. We're dissolving the regional arm, she said. Too much rot to salvage. We want to contribute to your Commons Fund out of penance and practicality. No one booed. It was work. The nationalizers waited until afternoon to try their trick. A delegation from the Colonial Secretariat presented a resolution to place the lattice under superplanetary stewardship for the benefit of all. The speaker was a man who could pronounce empathy and mean it until money entered the sentence. It works, Rhea replied. That's the orthodoxy. The Commons called a vote planetary participants plus off-world residents present. The teenagers ran the mic. The schoolteacher proposed an amendment to add lullabies, our infrastructure. The clinic requested funding follows minutes, not metrics. The Miners' Guild suggested no patents on patterns. The universities nodded, as if literature reviews had prepared them for chores. The vote passed, and the Secretariat delegation discovered that authority ages poorly against chairs that stack themselves. We'll observe, their leader said, which is how bureaucracies apologize without paperwork. To mark the day, someone suggested music. The school shelter choir hummed the storm lullaby. The lattice answered with a low, approving wash. For a moment, the planet and its people shared a time signature. Prospectors cried without taking notes. Predators checked their flights. With cameras rolling, the predators tried one last pivot, a philanthropic foundation offering governance toolkits for emerging commons. The toolkit included templates for impact narratives, a donor wall design, and a tasteful logo. The teenagers used the logo as a coaster and the donor wall as a place to hang wet coats. Maeve stepped to the mic with a spade in her hand because props matter. We're not telling a story about generosity, she said. We're writing a schedule about survival. She listed the week's chores: culvert widening, tunnel chalking, whiteboard restocking, stew rotation. The feed lost half its viewers and gained the right ones. That night, the lattice brightened in a patterned soul, translated as a map to a far-rim settlement with a note embedded: bring blankets. They went. The settlement had been trying to decide whether to leave after a series of stray collapses. The Commons crew fixed 3 things and taught 2 more. A hum for impatient shale and a negotiation pattern for neighbors who had taught themselves to argue louder than rock. On the way back, Rhea asked Maeve the question she had been postponing. If the lattice is a neighbor, what happens when it says no? Then we stop asking that thing, Maeve said, and we write it down as a rule. She tapped the ledger. Completion beats victory. No today beats yes with a crack tomorrow. A month later, off-world attention cooled to a manageable simmer. The prospectors either learned to stack chairs or went away. The predators discovered that boredom does not monetize and tried elsewhere. The Commons House settled into the glorious habit of maintenance. One evening, a new ship arrived, small, patched, stubborn. A woman stepped out wearing a jacket with old expedition patches and a face that looked like competence had chosen a home. I am Idris Imani, she said. Ren's child. The room exhaled in a key called O. Idris carried a pack that thumped like a promise and set it on the table. Inside was a device that looked like a prayer wheel crossed with an oscilloscope. My parent called it a pattern mill, she said. It spins local hum into helpful shapes without disturbing what it rests on. She set it on a vein. It hummed. The vein approved. The clinic's vitals monitor ticked smoother. Cost? Maeve asked. Practical to the last known. Your rules, Idris said. And a seat at the failure meeting. Sold, Rhea replied, because the only good currency is chairs. They closed Commons Day with no anthem, no ribbon, and only one speech, given by a teenager who'd inherited the whiteboard and a sense of theater. We thought we were coming to watch a miracle, they said into the mic, voice shaking just enough. Turns out we came to watch grown-ups keep promises. The room clapped once, then went back to chores. The Secretariat tried flattery next, which is a kind of siege. They offered Maeve Arden the title of Planetary Commons Director with a stipend. That could buy a small moon and a staff that looked like armor. She asked for a mop and 2 more clinic cots. They sent a monogram briefcase instead. The teenagers used it to store pencils. Power makes promises it cannot keep, Rhea said, watching officials hover near usefulness and miss. It also buys microphones. Chairs are louder, Maeve replied, and pointed at the whiteboard, where the week's chores left little room for speeches. Rhea's past arrived wearing her sister's face. Cade Calder stepped off a freighter with a debt in one pocket and pride in the other. You owe me a life, Cade said, soft and dangerous. You took the job Helios Vance offered to me, and you burned the bridge behind you. I burned the bridge because it was over a pit, Rhea said. But you're right. I left you on the wrong side. The room learned to hold 2 truths. Cade's debt wasn't metaphor. It was a bounty with interest for a smuggling charge that read like a poem about hunger. The creditor was local and cruel in petty ways that stain. Maeve put the problem on the whiteboard. The teenagers wrote, pay the debt, cost, pride, side effect. We keep a Calder. They paid it out of the Commons Fund and out of Rhea's savings and out of a jar the clinic kept for a different emergency. The creditor complained to the judge, who wrote a footnote. Debts that purchase people are void at this counter. Cade stayed, suspicious of hope, brilliant with engines, and allergic to authority that didn't stack chairs. She and Rhea learned to work in the same room without reopening the old argument, as if it were a wound that enjoyed attention. The lattice asked for a corridor that didn't exist. The pattern Idris Imani translated looked like a path through stone that would not be carved for years' temperature curves. Humidity averages, a humming schedule that made no sense with current tunnel geometry. Seeds, Maeve said, half laughing. It wants us to plant for seeds we haven't bred yet. The university sent plant scientists with pockets full of humility. Together they designed a trial, a corridor tuned to guide pollen and spore on quiet nights. A series of resting shelves for root tendrils to catch breath in thinner soils, and a lullaby in minor key for seeds that panic in dry air. Helios Vance's interim director showed up to help pour gravel. We wrecked our reputation here, she said, lifting with legs and contrition. We'd like to earn a neutral. Stack 10 chairs, the teenagers said. We'll talk. The corridor took shape over weeks, measured in calluses. It led nowhere useful yet, and that was the test. They were building a promise for a species that didn't exist. Or if it did, only as a glimmer in a graduate student's notebook. Maeve loved it the way people love nouns that haven't let money rename them. During all this, the Secretariat's offer kept returning like spam with better stationery. You can scale this, they insisted. Replicate the model across worlds. Publish a toolkit. We have a toolkit, Maeve said, and handed them a ladle. It measures gratitude. The test arrived as weather often does, disguised as inconvenience. A transport carrying 3 families and a case of yeast diverted in a sand squall, put down hard, and cracked a fuel cell. The beacon failed. The radio lied. The lattice pulsed yes 3 times, and then brightened along the unfinished corridor. Follow the hum, Maeve encoded, and carry the sleeping ones in shifts. There is water at the rest shelf. The corridor guided them like a river that didn't need wet. Seeds in the case woke early. Spores rode the pressure gradient like remembered songs. The families reached the Commons house before the fuel cell remembered fire. In the clinic, while Soul tended blisters that will become legends in small mouths. One of the children hummed the shelter lullaby unprompted, hands flat on the floor, as if learning its grammar. Cade watched and finally unclenched her jaw. "You build the world you wanted," she told Rhea without bitterness. "We," Rhea said, and Cade let the word stand. The Secretariat sent observers who, to their credit, had learned to wear work clothes. One asked if the Commons would franchise. The teenagers wrote on the whiteboard, "You can borrow our rules. Return them better." Idris Imani brought a new pattern mill modification. It could imprint a hum on ceramic tiles. They laid tiles along the corridor so the song would persist even when machinery slept. Maeve pressed a seed between two palms and whispered, "Find this," and hoped she had not lied. Rusk resurfaced because the past thinks it owns the right to interrupt. He'd found backing from a consortium that still believed wonder could be warehoused. He arrived with a camera crew wearing concern. "I only want what's best," he said, which is a sentence lawsuits love. Maeve handed him a broom. "Sweep," she said. He didn't. The crew filmed him not sweeping. The feed titled it Leadership. The comments titled it Nope. That evening, the Commons House hosted a failure meeting in Rusk's accidental honor. Item 1, we almost let Old Angler run the room. Item 2, we still need more cots. Item 3, the yeast survived. We owe bread to fate. The teenagers added Item 4, chairs stacked themselves. Psych. After on the pier, Maeve admitted to Rhea that she was tired of being asked to be a symbol when she preferred to be a hinge. "Hinges hold doors," Rhea said. "Let the teenagers be banners." The lattice pulsed again at midnight, pattern new and shy. Idris listened, smiled. "It wants a library," she said. "Not of books of patterns and minutes. A place where people can check out a hum and return it with notes." Maeve laughed until the pier remembered to echo. "We'll build a library that shushes lawyers." The teenagers cheered, because new shelves meant new mischief. The first seeds to test the corridor arrived in envelopes that looked like modesty. Crosses of dune grass and salt stubborn barley, a moss that liked thin air, a fern with ambitions. The plant scientists set them out like a choir learning parts. Idris tuned the pattern mill to print a hum into the tile bones of the path. The lattice brightened, then went steady, the approval of a tool that knows it won't be thanked properly. Maeve held a seed the way people hold news. "Find the song," she whispered, and pressed it into soil not much thicker than patience. The corridor wore cool, the kind that tells roots they can go farther than hope intended. Meanwhile, Rusk assembled his last coalition, a venture that called itself Steward and wore philanthropy as camouflage. Their plan was theatrical seize the Commons House with a court order from elsewhere, broadcast an intervention, force a referendum under their rules, and present it as rescue. They trained cameras on the door like guns. The door opened. Cade stepped out with a clipboard and a look that had made engines confess. "You're late," she said. "Failure meeting started 20 minutes ago." The cameras followed her inside because spectacle is obedient when confused. On stage actually a pallet, because Commons doesn't buy platforms. Maeve listed almosts. The corridor's third shelf ran dry in afternoon heat. Fix. Timed mist. The lullabies minor felt wrong for a family from the Driftlands. Fix. At a major turn on the third, the clinic ran out of gauze. Fix. More gauze. The room nodded, laughed, scribbled. "The rules," Maeve said. "The chairs. The whiteboard. The fact that we eat together." They moved to a vote, because votes are how rooms remember their decisions when power tries to edit. The resolution was simple. The Commons is not for sale or stewardship by any entity that cannot stack chairs. The tally was not close. Outside, the wind remembered a trick and brought dust. Cameras coughed. People moved towels and toddlers as if they'd rehearsed, which they had. Steward's social team posted a clip titled Anarchy. The comments labeled it Tuesday. In the corridor, seeds began to take the hum into themselves. The moss found tile seams and made them into strategy. The barley put roots into curves that weren't there last season and argued successfully with a stretch of stingy subsoil. The fern delayed germination the way wise things do, and then arrived all at once. The lattice sent a rhythm nobody recognized. Soul listened and smiled. "That's the sound of a place learning to keep promises," they said. Steward played their last card, a writ from a distant court authorizing seizure for global good. The marshal who came to serve it wore duty well and power poorly. He found the Commons House holding a library of patterns in its arms, a room where people checked out a hum and checked it back in with notes like, "Worked on clay if you hum lower. Whom do I arrest?" He asked, helpless in the face of chairs. "The person who owns this," Maeve said, and gestured to the whiteboard. The teenagers wrote the answer. "Everyone. Therefore, no one." The marshal frowned. "The law hates truth when it can't invoice it." He read the charter on the wall, the napkin opinion, the ledger of almosts. He looked at the storm shelter lullaby, transcribed in childish notation. He folded the writ and put it in his pocket. "Find me a chair," he said. Cade repaired the marshal's rover, because that's what neighbors do to uniforms when uniforms remember their people. Steward left to monetize, something less averse to boredom. Rusk's investors dropped him because he couldn't produce despair on schedule. He took a shuttle off world with a face that had learned it would never earn a statue. The corridor found its species on a morning that didn't advertise itself. A dusting rain crept in off the flats. The tiles sang as if forgiveness were physical. The barley stood taller than fear. A tiny insect, ancestor of 3 ecosystems the planet had nearly forgotten, skittered out of a crack and drank from a bead on the moss. Soul wept, which embarrassed no one. The school brought the younger children to see the library. They checked out the sleep hum for nap time and returned it with a note. Worked with blankets. The librarians wrote a rule. Children trump priorities. Idris added a symbol to the tiles for little feet to follow. At sunset, the Commons held no ceremony. They ate. The whiteboard read, "Chores for tomorrow." The ledger read, "Almosts we avoided today." The library closed itself because someone had designed it with hinges that knew dusk. Maeve walked to the original vault, the place where she had learned that the world under her boots had a nervous system. Rhea walked with her. "Do you miss the old life?" Rhea asked. "I miss not being this tired," Maeve said. "I don't miss being that useless." They pressed palms to the vein. "We kept our promise," Maeve told the lattice. "Share, schedule, stay." The lattice warmed once, twice, thrice. Then, indulgent, a fourth. "What's that one?" Rhea asked. "Rest," Idris said from the doorway, grinning. "Even geology wants you to sleep." Kadesh became the place other worlds called when their wonders misbehaved. The Commons exported rules, not ore. People sent shares. The library franchise spread like good gossip. Use, return, add. Teenagers everywhere discovered they could run rooms. And Maeve, who had been sent to farm a graveyard, found herself in a city of light that kept growing not because anyone dug faster, but because rooms kept promises out loud. She named the corridor not after herself, but after the habit that saved them. Completion Way. On a quiet morning, a ship nosed down with seeds from a world Maeve would never visit. She met it at the pier with a spade and a grin. "We have a song for that," she said, and the planet under her boots hummed back. Pleased to be useful, bored enough to be kind.